The rescue team had just called off the search. The warehouse roof was seconds from collapse, and the chief gave the order to fall back. They had written off the trapped worker as a loss. But from behind the safety tape, a 3-year-old girl in an oversized pink jacket tugged her mother's hand, pointed straight into the inferno, and spoke. Her name was Mia. She was 3 years old, the daughter of the night cleaner who arrived to a scene of retreating trucks and utter despair. The professionals saw a structural death sentence. The child saw a man in a window. This is the story of that frozen moment and the chain of impossible decisions that led to it. But first, you need to understand why everyone had already given up. The first flames were reported at 9:47 p.m. by a passing trucker on the interstate. He saw the orange glow against the low clouds and called it in. By the time Engine Company 17 arrived 6 minutes later, the old textile warehouse was breathing black smoke out of every broken window. Inside that building was Mark Rios, 42 years old, a shift foreman with 11 years at the plant. He was doing a final inventory check in the west loading bay when the power failed. He heard the pop of transformers, then the distant sound of glass breaking, and then the smell hit him. Not wood smoke, chemical, acrid and sweet. The stored synthetic fabrics were going up. Mark's radio crackled with the evacuation order. He turned toward the main bay doors, but a secondary explosion from the chemical storage locker blew a support beam down, sealing the corridor in a tangle of steel and concrete. His exit was gone. He was in a 30-foot by 40-foot bay with one skylight 20 feet above him and a wall of fire growing between him and the only other door. Outside, Battalion Chief Karen Vance stepped out of her command vehicle. She had 23 years on the job. She took one look at the roll-up doors bowing outward from the heat and knew this was a defensive fight from minute one. Her priority was containment. Prevent the fire from jumping to the adjacent plastics recycling plant, but protocol demanded a primary search. Someone had to try. Captain David Miller and his team from Engine 17 geared up. They entered through the least involved east entry, following the thermal imaging camera. The camera showed heat blooms everywhere. The structure was a maze of old partitions and piled stock. The temperature inside was already climbing past 600 degrees. They had maybe 10 minutes of viable search time before the floor above would become unstable. They called out no response. The crackle of the fire and the groan of the building swallowed their voices. They pushed 30 feet in, then 50. The thermal camera caught a shape in the west bay, a human form moving. They radioed it in. Chief Vance acknowledged, "You have 7 minutes, then you fall back. The roof is showing signs of stress." Meanwhile, across town, Elena Santos was putting her daughter Mia to bed. Elena worked the overnight cleaning shift at the industrial park. 3 warehouses, including the one now on fire, her babysitter had cancelled. Again. So she bundled Mia into her pink winter jacket, strapped her into the car seat, and drove to work. She was 15 minutes late. She saw the glow in the sky from 2 miles away. She pulled into the lot just as Captain Miller's team was coming back out. They were moving fast, dragging their hose line. One of them was shouting into his radio, "We have visual confirmation of one victim in the West Bay. The interior collapse zone is expanding. We cannot reach him." Chief Vance's face was lit by the dashboard lights of the command truck. She listened to the report. She looked at the structural schematic on her tablet. The building was a Type 2 non-combustible construction, but it was built in 1968. The roof was a lightweight concrete deck on steel bar joists. In a fire like this, those joists could fail without warning. The entire west section was a red zone on her screen. She got on the radio. "All interior teams, evacuate the structure now." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. The safety of her firefighters was non-negotiable. The risk of a catastrophic roof collapse outweighed the possibility of a rescue. The math was brutal, but it was the math. From the perimeter, Elena watched the firefighters retreat. She held Mia's hand, her heart hammering. She knew the night security guard, an older man named Joe, but Mark Rios sometimes worked late too. She scanned the faces of the gathered crews, looking for someone who had gotten out. She saw only grim expressions. Captain Miller approached Chief Vance, his helmet off, his face streaked with soot. "Chief, we saw him. He's trapped, not incapacitated." He was waving. If we can get a ladder to the west exterior wall, maybe we can breach. Vance cut him off. Look at the west wall, David. The entire western facade was pulsing with heat, the paint blistering off. The skylight they'd seen on the schematic was now a vent for a column of flame. Any exterior operation there is a suicide mission. The building is coming down. We've lost. The word hung in the air, lost. It was the worst word in their vocabulary. They'd done the primary search. They confirmed a life, and they were pulling back. Protocol was clear. You never risk a life for a body. The assumption was that no one could survive the conditions that were about to follow. Elena heard the defeat in their postures. She felt Mia tugging on her hand, trying to see past the legs of the firefighters. The little girl was pointing at the building, babbling about the big candles. Elena picked her up, shushing her, turning her face away from the awful sight. But Mia squirmed in her arms, insistent. She pointed again, not at the flames, but at a dark, lower section of the west wall. A small, high window, barely more than a vent, that wasn't glowing. It was black. Man, Mama, Mia said, her voice clear and certain against the roar. Man in the window. Elena frowned, trying to see. She saw nothing but smoke and shadow. There's no one there, baby. Mia's small hand shot out, her finger unwavering. There, the sad man, in the window. And that's when Elena saw it. A pale smear against the dark glass, a hand, then a face pressed against it, visible for a second before being swallowed by a drift of smoke. Mark Rios was at that window, one story up, in a pocket of air that hadn't yet been consumed. He was alive, and every single professional on the scene believed he was already dead. For 5 full seconds, nobody moved. Elena Santos was just a cleaner holding her child. Her words weren't a radio report from a trained professional. They were a mother's shaky relay of a toddler's observation. In the hierarchy of a fireground, it was the lowest priority intelligence imaginable. Chief Vance turned, her expression not unkind, but strained with the weight of command. Ma'am, you need to step back behind the line. It's not safe here. But Elena didn't move. Mia was still pointing, her little arm unwavering. She sees him, right there, in that little window. Captain Miller followed the line of the child's finger. He knew that window. It was a vent window for the old office mezzanine in the West Bay, about 15 feet off the ground. On the schematic, it was marked as an interior space, not an exterior wall, but if the interior walls had burned through. He grabbed the thermal imaging camera from his engineer and trained it on the spot. The screen was a wash of blinding whites and oranges, the heat signature from the surrounding fire overwhelming everything. He filtered, adjusted the sensitivity, and then he saw it, a vertical strip of cooler temperature, a ghostly blue outline in a sea of red. It was exactly where the child was pointing. Chief, Miller said, his voice tight, I've got an anomaly, a cold spot right there. Vance came over, looked at the screen. The cooler area was small, maybe 2 feet by 4 feet. It could be a pocket of air. It could be nothing. It could be a man pressed against a window, his body heat a faint signature against the inferno around him. The timing was impossible. If he was there, how had he gotten from the loading bay floor to a mezzanine office 15 feet up? The answer came from Mark Rios himself. Inside the West Bay, Mark was not on the ground. When the beam fell, it didn't trap him in a corner. It created a ramp of debris. He climbed it, coughing, his shirt pulled over his mouth, driven by pure animal instinct to get up, to get away from the rising flood of toxic smoke. He found a metal staircase, its lower half glowing hot, that led to a supervisor's office overlooking the bay. The office was a glass box. One window looked inward, now onto a floor of fire. The other was the small, grimy vent window to the outside world. He'd broken it with a chair, letting in a gasp of cold night air. That pocket of air was keeping him alive. He saw the retreating lights of the firefighters. He saw the ladder trucks pulling back. He'd pounded on the glass until his hands were bruised, but the sound was lost. He was a ghost watching his own rescue party leave. Until he saw a small figure in a bright pink jacket, pointing right at him. Outside, the debate was furious and quiet. It's a thermal ghost, David, Vance said, her eyes on the sagging roofline. The whole west wall is compromised. Sending a team in, or even placing a ladder there, is a potential death sentence. We follow the protocol. We've already exceeded it. Miller's knuckles were white on the camera. The protocol is based on the information we have. We have new information, a visual sighting corroborated by a thermal anomaly. A sighting from a 3-year-old. Who saw what we didn't? Miller shot back, then lowered his voice. Karen, we wrote him off. We told ourselves he was already gone so we could live with pulling back. What if we're wrong? That question hung between them, heavier than the smoke. It was the firefighter's eternal dilemma, risk a life for a life, but the calculus had changed. It was no longer risk a life for a body. It was risk multiple lives for an asterisk possible life. The odds were still terrible. Elena, standing frozen with Mia in her arms, understood the silence. She saw the doubt on the chief's face, the desperate hope on the captain. She did something she had never done in her life. She interrupted. His name is Mark, she said, her voice trembling but clear. Mark Rios. He has 2 boys. He showed me their picture last week. They're 8 and 10. He was buying them new bikes for their birthdays. She didn't know if that would matter, but she had to make him a person, not a thermal ghost. It did matter. Captain Miller looked at Chief Vance. We have a location, a specific small location. We don't need to enter the building. We need to reach that window. We can use the articulated ladder from the platform truck. We can breach the wall from the outside. Vance stared at the building. The west wall groaned, a deep, metallic sound that vibrated through the ground. A shower of sparks erupted from the roof. That wall could pancake if we touch it with a ladder. You know that. Then we don't touch the wall, a new voice said. It was the engineer Rodriguez. He'd been studying the schematic on a tablet. The mezzanine office, it's a steel-framed box, welded to the main structural columns. It might hold even if the wall sheeting fails. The window is set in its own frame. If we can get a ladder to the window *sill*, not the wall, we transfer the load to the office structure. It was a thread of logic, a thin, technical, desperate thread. And then what? Vance asked, her arms crossed. We kiss him through the glass. The window's 18 by 24 inches. He's not fitting through that. You don't need him to, Miller said, his mind racing. We breach the wall * around the window frame. From the outside in, we use the concrete saw. We cut a hole big enough to pull him out. The office is a steel box. We cut through the exterior sheeting and insulation. We hit the steel studs of the office wall. We cut through those. It's a can-opener operation, but we can do it from the ladder platform. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It relied on a steel-framed room inside a failing building remaining intact long enough to be cut open. It required firefighters to operate heavy machinery on a ladder basket 15 feet in the air next to a wall that was minutes from collapse. Chief Vance closed her eyes. In her 23 years, she had lost 2 firefighters. Both times, it was because a calculated risk became a fatal error. The weight of that history was in her next breath. You have 1 attempt, she said, her voice low and final. 1, you get the ladder positioned. You get 1 man in the basket with the saw. You have 5 minutes of cutting time. I'm watching that roof. The second I see a major shift, I am ordering a full evacuation and we are not coming back. Do you understand? This is not a rescue mission anymore. This is a body recovery that we are attempting from a safer distance. You are going up there to confirm he is dead. Is that clear? It was the only way she could authorize it, by downgrading the objective, by protecting herself and her crew from the crushing hope of a rescue. Captain Miller nodded, a sharp, grim motion. Understood, Chief. Body recovery operation. He turned and started barking orders. The platform truck roared to life, its red lights slicing through the smoke. The articulated ladder began to unfold, its movements slow and precise. Firefighter Rodriguez started the concrete saw, its diamond blades screaming to life with a whine that cut through the fire's roar. Elena pulled Mia back to the triage area, her hands shaking. She sat on the bumper of an ambulance, holding her daughter close. Mia had stopped pointing. She was now watching the big ladder move, her thumb in her mouth. Is the sad man coming out now, Mama? She asked, her voice muffled. I don't know, baby, Elena whispered, her eyes fixed on the men preparing to ascend into the nightmare. I just don't know. On the platform basket, Captain Miller and Firefighter Rodriguez secured their harnesses. The saw, a monstrous 60-pound machine, was tethered to the basket. Below them, the west wall of the warehouse pulsed with heat. They could feel it through their turnout gear. The ladder operator inched the basket forward, aiming for the small, dark rectangle of the vent window. Inside his glass prison, Mark Rios saw the ladder coming. He saw the basket, the figures in yellow. He slammed his hands against the window again, fresh tears cutting through the soot on his face. They were coming back. They had seen him. The basket stopped, 6 feet from the wall. Any closer risked the ladder arm putting pressure on the compromised structure. Miller leaned out, shining a powerful spotlight at the window. He saw the handprints. He saw the frantic face behind the glass. Alive, terrifyingly, miraculously alive. He gave a thumbs up, not to Mark, but to the chief watching from below. Visual confirmation. Subject is alive. In the command truck, Chief Vance saw the signal. Her stomach dropped. The mission had just changed. This was no longer a body recovery. It was a rescue, and her people were now committed. "Start your clock," she said into the radio, her voice devoid of all emotion. 5 minutes. Rodriguez lifted the screaming saw. The diamond blade touched the exterior metal sheeting next to the window frame. A volcano of sparks erupted, showering the basket in a cascade of orange and white. The cut began, slow and grinding, through layers of steel and insulation. Inside, Mark Rios covered his ears, the noise deafening in his small space. They had 5 minutes to cut a hole in a burning building, and the entire west roof above them was beginning to sag, like a tired mouth opening to swallow them whole. The first 60 seconds of cutting were pure, brutal physics. The diamond blade screamed through the corrugated metal siding like it was paper, but then it hit the steel stud, and it stopped. A shower of sparks died to a pathetic fizzle. Rodriguez pulled the saw back, swearing, "Captain, it's not just a stud, it's a double channel. This whole office frame is reinforced." Inside, Mark saw the sparks stop. The screaming whine of the saw died. His hope, which had soared, plummeted like a stone. He pressed his face to the hot glass, his breath fogging it. "Don't stop," he yelled, knowing they couldn't hear him. On the basket, Miller radioed down. "We've hit reinforced steel. The blade isn't rated for this thickness. We need the oxyacetylene torch." In the command truck, Chief Vance's jaw tightened. The torch. It was slower. It was more dangerous. It required the basket to be perfectly stable as the flame could backlash, and it created a whole new set of risks: flammable insulation, potential for igniting gases inside the wall cavity. The 5-minute clock was already ticking down to 4. "Bring up the torch," she said, her voice flat. "But you now have 3 minutes of cutting time. That roof is moving. I can see it from here." The exchange took 90 seconds. 90 seconds of Mark pounding on the glass, watching the orange glow of the main fire creep closer across the ceiling of the vast bay below his mezzanine. The heat in his little office was becoming unbearable, the air thick and chemical sweet. He started coughing violently, his vision swimming. Below, Elena watched the frantic activity. She saw the new equipment going up. She saw the hesitation. Mia, bored now and cold, had started to fuss. "I want to go home, Mama." "Soon, baby," Elena murmured, her eyes glued to the basket. She wasn't watching the rescue. She was watching the roof. She cleaned this warehouse for 2 years. She knew where the leaks were when it rained. She knew the old foreman had complained about the west roof sagging for months. She could see that sag now, deep and ominous, outlined against the hellish glow. The torch went to work. This was a different kind of violence. Instead of screaming sparks, there was the hissing jet of blue flame, a concentrated sun melting through steel. It was slower, but it was steady. A molten line of orange began to crawl vertically up the wall next to the window frame. But the heat transfer was immediate. Inside the office, the wall became a radiator. Mark yelped, pulling his hand back from the interior sheeting. It was hot to the touch. The small pocket of breathable air was being cooked from the outside in. He did the only thing he could think of. He tore off his shirt, soaked it in the dirty water from a forgotten coffee cup on the desk, and stuffed it along the base of the wall where the cutting was happening, trying to cool it. It sizzled and steamed. On the basket, Miller watched the torch's progress. 1 minute down, Rodriguez grunted, his arms shaking from holding the heavy torch steady. We're maybe a third of the way through this first vertical cut. We need 2 verticals and a horizontal. We need a miracle. And then the miracle failed them. A deep, shuddering groan echoed through the entire structure. It wasn't a crack. It was a long, tired moan of metal giving up. On the command track's thermal camera, a new red line appeared along the entire western roofline. A primary support beam, superheated and weakened, had begun to yield. All units fall back. Chief Vance's voice crackled over the radio, sharp with alarm. Ladder platform, abort cut. Evacuate immediately. Chief, we are inches from breakthrough, Miller shouted back, his hand pressed to his ear. The west roof is failing. It is an order, Captain. Get off that wall now. Miller looked at Rodriguez. Rodriguez looked at the molten line in the steel, so close to completing the first cut. He looked at the window, at Mark's terrified face. He made a decision. He ignored the order. He kept cutting. Rodriguez, what are you doing? Miller yelled. He dies if we stop, Rodriguez yelled back over the hiss of the torch. 30 more seconds. It was mutiny. It was a firefighter betting his life, his career, and the life of his captain against a structural certainty. On the ground, Chief Vance saw the torch still burning. She understood immediately. A wave of cold fury and terror washed over her. She had lost firefighters before. She was watching it happen again, in slow motion, by choice. Miller, get control of your man, or I will have you both brought up on charges, she screamed into the radio. But it was too late for charges. The groan became a sharp, metallic shriek. A section of the lightweight concrete roof, 20 feet to the left of the office, peeled away like a cracker and collapsed inward. A huge fireball erupted, rolling through the interior space, sucking oxygen in with a terrifying roar. The building breathed in, then exhaled a plume of black smoke and debris out of every opening. The shockwave hit the ladder basket. It swayed violently, slamming Miller and Rodriguez against the rails. Rodriguez lost his grip on the torch. It fell, swinging on its tether, the deadly blue flame whipping through the air. Miller grabbed for it, searing his glove, managing to kill the valve. Inside the office, the world turned upside down. The collapse wasn't on top of Mark, but the pressure wave blew out the interior window facing the bay. A storm of hot ash, sparks, and superheated air blasted into his space. He threw himself to the floor, covering his head with his arms, screaming. The pocket of cool air was gone, replaced with an oven. On the ground, Elena screamed, pulling Mia into her chest, turning away from the blast of heat. When she looked back, the west side of the warehouse was a crumbling, roaring beast, and the ladder basket was still there, dangling next to it. Chief Vance was already moving. All hand lines, protect that ladder, soak the area around it. Do not let the fire reach the fuel tank on that platform truck. A new priority, save the rescuers who had disobeyed her to try and save one man. In the basket, Miller and Rodriguez coughed, their eyes streaming from the smoke. The cut was incomplete. They had failed. The building was actively dying around them. Miller looked at Mark's window. He couldn't see the face anymore, just black smoke pouring out of the vent window. We have to go down, Rodriguez said, his voice hollow with defeat. Miller didn't argue. He gave the signal to the operator. The basket began to retract. But as it pulled back, Miller saw something. The heat and the shockwave had done something unintended. The vertical cut they'd made, though incomplete, had weakened the steel. The pressure from the interior explosion had pushed outward, and a section of the exterior wall around the window frame, a triangular piece about 2 feet wide, had bent outward like a loose tooth. It wasn't a hole, but it was an opening, a jagged, metal-toothed opening leaking smoke. Stop, Miller yelled. Hold position. He leaned out, risking searing his face, and shone his spotlight at the opening. Through the swirling smoke, for a fraction of a second, he saw a hand reaching out through the jagged metal, grasping at empty air. Mark wasn't dead. He was at the opening. He was trying to get out through a hole that was still too small, surrounded by razor-sharp, red-hot steel. They had given him a glimpse of escape, and now they were leaving him with it. Miller made another decision. He grabbed the Halligan bar, a heavy, forged steel prying tool from the basket's equipment rack. "We're not done," he said to Rodriguez. "We lever it open. The chief will court-martial us. Then she can court-martial me while I'm carrying a man down this ladder. Now help me." They repositioned the basket, bringing it dangerously close to the hot, crumbling wall again. Miller jammed the forked end of the Halligan bar into the narrow opening. Rodriguez added his weight. They pushed, muscles corded, against the heat-warped steel. And with a sound of tearing metal, the opening widened, 6 inches, then a foot. A hand shot out of the hole, grabbing the Halligan bar, then an arm, streaked with soot and blood. Mark Rios was forcing himself through a gap that was still, by any sane measure, too small. "Stop, you'll get cut to ribbons," Miller yelled. But Mark didn't stop. Survival had narrowed his world to one imperative: get through the hole. He squeezed his head and shoulders through, the torn metal scraping across his back. He was screaming, a raw, animal sound of pain and effort. Miller and Rodriguez dropped the tool and grabbed him. They got him under the armpits, hauling with everything they had. For a terrible second, he was stuck, his hips wedged in the jagged steel. Then, with a final, brutal pull, he came free, tumbling into the basket in a heap of bleeding, burned flesh and torn clothing. The basket, now with 3 men and off balance, lurched. The operator below fought the controls, stabilizing it. "We have him," Miller roared into the radio, his voice breaking. "We have the victim. Bring us down now." As the basket began its slow, torturous descent, the entire west roof of the warehouse, with one final, resigned sigh, collapsed inward in a slow-motion avalanche of concrete and fire. The office mezzanine, the steel box that had been Mark's prison and then his salvation, was swallowed whole. They had beaten the collapse by less than 30 seconds. On the ground, a wave of stunned silence swept over the firefighters, followed by a burst of frantic activity as paramedics rushed forward. Elena Santos sank to her knees, crying freely, holding a confused Mia. Chief Vance stood by her truck, her face an unreadable mask of relief, fury, and profound shock. Mark Rios was alive, he was out. But as the paramedics loaded his broken, burned body into the ambulance, a new and terrible question presented itself. What had it cost? The cost was measured in blood, burns, and broken rules. Mark Rios was rushed to the trauma center with second-degree burns across his back and shoulders, 4 broken ribs, and a lung scorched by superheated air. He would live, but the fire that nearly killed him was about to ignite a different kind of blaze. Captain David Miller and firefighter Luis Rodriguez were ordered to report to headquarters the next morning. They stood in Battalion Chief Karen Vance's office, still smelling of smoke, their hands bandaged from the rescue. The air was colder than the warehouse had been. "You disobeyed a direct evacuation order," Vance said, her voice quiet and precise. "You risked your lives, each other's lives, and the life of your ladder operator. You compromised the safety of the entire operation. Explain to me why I shouldn't suspend you both without pay and recommend termination." Miller didn't flinch. "Because the order was based on the assumption that the victim was already dead, Chief. We had visual confirmation he was alive. The variable changed. We adapted." "You mutinied." "We completed the mission," Rodriguez said, his own voice steady. "We got him out." Vance leaned back in her chair. On her desk was a preliminary incident report. The final collapse had occurred 28 seconds after the ladder basket touched down. The margin was so thin it was terrifying. She had also watched the bodycam footage from Miller's helmet. She had seen Mark Rios's hand reaching out of that jagged hole. She had spent the night watching it on a loop. "The department is launching a full review," she said finally. "Until it's concluded, you're both on administrative leave, dismissed." The review was a storm. It pored over radio transcripts, thermal imaging data, structural reports. It interviewed every firefighter on scene, including the ladder operator who had feared for his life. It interviewed Elena Santos. Elena sat in a small, bright conference room, feeling more out of place than she had in the firelit dark. She explained again and again what Mia had seen, how she had pointed, how she had said, "The sad man in the window." The investigators listened, their faces neutral. One of them, a woman with kind eyes, asked if Mia could point to where she saw the man on a picture of the building. They showed Mia a photograph of the warehouse. The 3-year-old, clutching her stuffed rabbit, didn't hesitate. She put her finger directly on the vent window. Then she moved her finger to the left, to a blank section of wall. And the fire was there, she said, but the man was here. She had distinguished between the location of the flames and the location of the person, a nuance the thermal camera had missed in the overwhelming heat. That statement found its way into the final review, under a subheading titled Civilian Contribution. Mark Rios woke up in the intensive care unit 3 days later. His wife, Sarah, was holding his hand. His 2 boys had drawn pictures taped to the wall. His body was a map of pain, but he was alive. His first rasping question was, "Who got me out?" He learned about the firefighters who had cut the hole. He learned about the chief who had called the retreat. And he learned about the cleaner and her little girl. He asked to see them. A week later, Elena and Mia came to the hospital. Mia wore her pink jacket. She was shy, hiding behind her mother's legs. Mark, propped up in his bed, his torso wrapped in bandages, smiled through the pain. "You're the one who pointed," he said to Mia, his voice a rough whisper. Mia nodded, peeking out. "You have very good eyes," Mark said. "Thank you." Mia considered this. Then she walked forward, reached into her pocket, and pulled out a slightly melted, foil-wrapped chocolate coin. She placed it carefully on his blanket. "For you," she said, "to feel better." Mark looked at the chocolate coin, then at Elena, his eyes shining. It was a gesture as simple and profound as her pointing finger, a child's solution to pain. The department's review took 6 weeks. Its conclusion was a seismic event in the firehouse. It found that Captain Miller and Firefighter Rodriguez had indeed violated direct command protocol. They were issued formal written reprimands, which would stay in their files for 3 years. But the review also found that their on-scene reassessment and subsequent actions, while insubordinate, resulted in the preservation of a life that would have been lost. The recommendation was for retraining in risk assessment communication, not termination. Battalion Chief Vance's decision to order the initial retreat was upheld as correct and by the book. Her decision to authorize the single, downgraded body recovery attempt was noted as a reasonable adaptation to new, if unorthodox, information. But the final page of the report held the surprise. The structural engineer's analysis of the collapse revealed something no one had known. The steel-framed office mezzanine was not, as the original blueprints showed, simply welded to the columns. It had been reinforced years earlier to support a heavy safe. That extra steel was what had resisted the saw, but it was also what had created an unintended survival capsule. The office had detached from the collapsing main roof and fallen straight down, intact, into the inferno. Mark Rios would have been killed instantly if he had remained inside. By forcing him out through the hole, Miller and Rodriguez hadn't just saved him from the fire. They had saved him from a crushing death that would have followed seconds later. The margin of survival was even thinner than anyone had thought. The report concluded with a new non-binding guideline. Command should consider credible civilian observations, regardless of source, as potential data points in dynamic risk assessment, without allowing them to override established safety protocols. It was a bureaucrat's way of saying, sometimes a 3-year-old might see what you miss. A month later, Captain Miller and Firefighter Rodriguez returned to duty. The first call they ran together was a medical assist, nothing dramatic. On the ride back, Rodriguez was quiet. "You thinking about the reprimand?" Miller asked. "No," Rodriguez said. "I'm thinking about the chocolate coin. My kid does stuff like that. It changes the air in the room, you know." Miller nodded. He did know. Chief Vance retired a year later, on schedule. At her ceremony, she shook Miller's hand. "You still drive me crazy, Captain," she said. "I know, Chief, thank you." There was no further discussion of that night. It was understood. Elena Santos received a commendation from the city for civic bravery. She used the small stipend that came with it to take a certified nursing assistant course. She still cleans, but now she also works at the rehab center where Mark did his physical therapy. Mark Rios never worked in a warehouse again. The burns on his back left scars that tightened when the weather changed. He started a safety consulting business, specializing in industrial fire prevention. His first client was the company that owned the burned-out warehouse. He insisted they hire Elena's cleaning company for the new building's contract. And Mia started kindergarten. She drew pictures of firefighters and a little girl in a pink jacket. She sometimes points at things, a bird on a wire, a cloud that looks like a rabbit. Her mother never tells her to stop. This story doesn't end with a parade. Real ones rarely do. It ends with a man who hugs his sons a little tighter, a fire captain who listens a little more closely to his gut, a cleaner who looks at her daughter and sees a kind of wisdom she can't explain. And it ends with a question that every firefighter, every paramedic, every person who has ever stood on the edge of a disaster must ask themselves: when do you stop following the protocol and start following the pointing finger? The answer, it turns out, isn't in the manual. It's in the space between a retreat order and a child's certainty. It's in the last possible second, in the heat and the noise and the fear, when someone decides that a single life is worth a mutiny. So what do we do with a story like this? Do we file it away as a lucky break, a one-in-a-million exception to the rule, or do we let it quietly change the rules we carry inside ourselves? We live in a world that trusts systems, protocols, procedures, chain of command. We build them for good reason. They keep order, they prevent chaos, they save lives. But this story isn't about the failure of a system, it's about its limits. The system said retreat. The human heart, witnessed through a child's eyes, said wait. Mia didn't see a thermal image or a structural report. She saw a sad man in a window. That was her entire data set, and it was enough. We often talk about courage as a loud thing, a running into flames. But the first and most profound act of courage that night was a whisper. It was a mother believing her toddler enough to speak up to people in uniform who knew better. It was a firefighter hearing that whisper and deciding, against every instinct of self-preservation, to look again. The true lesson isn't that we should ignore expertise. It's that expertise sometimes needs a partner. It needs humility. It needs the willingness to admit that the map is not the territory, and sometimes the territory holds a surprise pointed out by the smallest among us. Mark Rios got a second chance at life. Captain Miller and firefighter Rodriguez got reprimands and the unshakable knowledge that they did the wrong thing. Chief Vance carried the weight of a decision that was both correct and incomplete. And Elena and Mia just went back to their lives, a little less invisible than before. Nothing was perfectly resolved, but everything was changed. If this story found something in you, if it reminded you of a time you spoke up when it wasn't your place, or a time someone listened to you when they didn't have to, then you understand why we tell these stories. They are the quiet antidote to a loud world. They are the proof that the most powerful force isn't a rulebook or a raging fire. It's the stubborn, simple act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and refusing to look away. We tell these stories for the people who point when everyone else has turned their backs. We tell them for the people who are still waiting at the window. If you believe in stories like this, in the power of a second look, a whispered truth, a pointing finger, then this channel is your home. Subscribe, join us. Share this with someone who needs the reminder that no one is ever truly beyond reach. There are more stories like this waiting, and we'll be here, ready to tell them.